Well, hello there, and welcome to another portrait painting demonstration. In this week's episode, we will create this Rembrandt master study that you're seeing here in an effort to explore the depths of classical realism. Welcome to Old Master Painting Demonstration. And if you're ever curious about what materials I like to use, please check the description box of this video for a list of the materials used in this video. And now here is the original Rembrandt, painted in 1633. This is a cropped image from Google Arts and Culture. Please check out Google Arts and Culture and search Rembrandt for very high quality resolution images to paint from. Now getting started with this demonstration, we are using a size 2 filbert bristle brush. We've added a little drop, as you see there, of spike lavender. And spike lavender is my solvent that I'm going to use to dilute this raw umber oil paint down to a consistency that is good enough for me to sketch onto the canvas. And what I aim for is a very loose sketch in the beginning using raw umber diluted again with spike lavender. And the spike lavender, you really only need a drop at a time to use. I use maybe enough just to get the paint to flow, although raw umber on its own is pretty transparent, so you really don't need a lot. And so we're starting on a 11 by 14 inch oil primed linen. This is a quadruple oil primed, very fine textured linen from the Claessens brand, and it was toned several weeks ago, a neutral gray color, also using oil paint, alkyd oil paints, which are fast drying oil paints. And now, as you're seeing here, we're just getting an idea of the outside shape, basically the big shape, the big geometry in a very simplistic fashion. No measuring goes into this, and the important thing about it is that you're keeping your shapes simple and easy so that you're able to build onto these shapes and reason with the shapes rather than doing a perfect copy. Although there are instances where you would want to do something like a perfect copy where you would trace out every single light and shadow mark and the proportions, but this is more of a freehand, simple and easy sketch. This is a much more relaxing way to work, although I always encourage, especially my students, to explore different ways of working. Now then, the important thing with the placement of the features at this point is to use simple straight lines and angles and place down the shapes using intuition. Mainly just bouncing my eye back and forth from the photo reference to the canvas is the way that I'm approaching the accuracy. It starts off very simple, abstract, sometimes scary looking in the beginning, and then you'll see how we build onto this and create more and more of a refined shape. So now we're starting to put in a little indicator there for the cheekbone structure. Now the cheekbone structure is going to be right across the side of the nose. That is also known as the zygomatic bone, the cheekbone. So that plane is cutting very loosely across the side. Again, just using raw umber and a simple enough start is all that you really need. And we're going to use color to draw, and we're going to use color to figure out even more specific planes. So let's go ahead and start to do that. So we're using a little bit of flake white, lead tin yellow, and we're mixing with a palette knife because with the palette knife we're going to be able to get a larger and more consistent mixture of oil paint. So now we've mixed in a little bit of yellow ochre, transparent mummy, and then raw umber. And now most of you are familiar with the colors that I'm saying except for transparent mummy. So when you're wondering about transparent mummy, it is a Rublev color. The important thing is not so much the name transparent mummy, although it's pretty cool to say, but transparent mummy is an iron oxide red, and it is pigment PR102. That is pigment red 102. So many other brands actually sell the same pigment turned into oil paint under different names. So feel free to shop around for pigment PR102 as it is one of the most useful, in my opinion, colors when it comes to mixing skin tones. And since we're talking about mixing skin tones, Now we're actually mixing up a different shade of a similar skin tone. And notice that we've used a little bit of blue now into the mix. So the blue that I like to use in the skin tones is Cobalt blue. It is a in the middle kind of blue. It's kind of the perfect primary blue when it comes to oil painting. Although, as I always say, I encourage you to experiment with as many colors as you like. But the idea here is to create pre-mixtures of different shades, all the while observing the model, which is the photo reference, of course, to create these different shades. So now we're using burnt sienna, lead white, and yellow ochre. Now you'll hear me say flake white or lead white. The idea here is it's just a lead-based white, whether you call it lead white or flake white. It's the same. The one that I like to start off with is the linseed oil-based one, and I actually finish the painting with the walnut oil-based one, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But in any case, now we're mixing from the burnt sienna, yellow ochre kind of brownish mixture, and you saw we added the cobalt blue. Now we're going in, we're mixing a little bit of a grayish cool tone. So this is black and white. So this is vine black that we're using here, which is the same as, pretty much handles the same as ivory black. It's just a different one to use just to change things up. Still handles the same. It's a Rublev color, and my cobalt blue is actually not a Rublev color. It is a Williamsburg color. But nonetheless, the brands don't matter as much as long as they are high quality oil paints. You can use whichever brand you prefer, but the important thing is knowing how to mix with them. So now we've just mixed white and transparent mummy, and now we're good to go. Now we're going to load up the paintbrush, and we're going to start to basically pile on the paint. And so the way I'm doing this is with 0 medium and no solvent and bristle brushes. That is a size 4 filbert bristle brush from the brand Silver Brush. And no, I'm not sponsored by any of these brands, though I wish I was. The important thing about bristle brushes is that they can carry a lot of paint. And when you're working with a, say, classical Rembrandt study, if you're trying to recreate a Rembrandt, it would be to your benefit to use higher quality oil paints such as Rublev's and Williamsburg, and using bristle brushes to carry your paint. And while you're at it, also your paint support should be in oil primed linen. Again, if you're trying to go for the old master style approach, or at least stylistically speaking, old master aesthetic. Highly recommend using oil primed linen, especially if you've never used it before. The combination of all these materials together is just a lot of fun. And in fact, when you look at a lot of Rembrandt paintings or a lot of old master paintings, they look fun. If you look really closely at them, it looks like it was a lot of fun to layer all the paint into the surface. It's almost sometimes when you look at a Rembrandt that the paint looks like it was woven into the fabric of the linen, and it's just about as important to think about your painting surface as it is how you are drawing with paint. Now remember, painting, you can think of painting as just drawing with color. That's one way to look at it, but you also need to look at the textural effects that go into the painting. And now, as I'm starting to fill in these light shapes, we're really going to start to draw with color. So we're going to talk a little more now about what it means to draw with color, especially when you're trying to create a very classical, realistic, old master inspired study. So in fact, the best way, in my opinion, to approach a highly realistic classical style painting is actually to go from simple to complex. And while you're going from simple to complex, make sure to pile on the paint and work with the paint in such a way that the paint moves with the fluidity that seems almost magical, very sculptural. And the way that you can get these textures, again, is from taking right from pre-mixed piles on your palette. Now, as you notice, there are barely any other mixtures on the palette. In fact, I'm just mixing with palette knife as I go to recharge. Now let's talk about another color that I'm using, which is very much Old Master inspired. In fact, Rembrandt definitely had access to this color that I'm going to talk about, which is lead tin yellow. And I'm using lead tin yellow type 1, which is a lighter lead tin yellow. So it's lead tin yellow light. And the brand that I'm using for that is Micheal Harding, though eventually I will work up to the Rublev, not saying that they're any different, but I want to try a different brand for lead tin yellow, which is the Rublev version. All that aside, lead tin yellow is, as you're seeing here, an excellent lemon type yellow. And in fact, I did mix it into the middle tones and into the darker middle tones. Why would I do that? I did it because I saw that the skin tones were actually a little less orangey. So that's why we went for the lead tin yellow. And in fact, even the middle tone, the darker middle tone, is getting a little more of the cobalt blue. Now, the old masters would not have had cobalt blue, at least to my understanding. So what they would have done was use more black or lapis lazuli, which is the genuine ultramarine blue, if I can even pronounce that correctly, into their mixtures, probably similar to what we're doing here. In fact, it's not that different from what they did before. All it is just pigment and oil. Mix the pigment and oil together, you get paint. Mix different colors of paint with different pigments together, and they mix into a different color. And that's all it really is. As long as you keep your mind focused on the tonalities and the hues in relation to one another, all you're doing really is just putting the paint together and sculpting it into a naturalistic form. That being said, let me talk a little bit about this darker color that you're seeing me mix up here. In fact, it has a little influence of the warmth in it, which has a little bit of alizarin crimson, which I like to sneak into the darker colors. Now, if you're worried about how fugitive alizarin crimson has been shown to be throughout history, go for alizarin permanent if you want a more light, fast approach to your colors. That being said, the two handle pretty much the same. So now we're going and we're building the midtones little by little, and now we're basically caking on the highlight on the forehead. But in fact, each section, as you're seeing, appears pretty transparent. And if you're wondering why that is, it is because of flake white. Now let's talk about flake white and lead-based white with respect to an old master style painting like you're seeing here. Lead-based whites is what they had in oil paints back then. They did not have titanium white back in the day, back in the 17th century. They had lead white, and Rembrandt would have had the Dutch process style created Dutch process style lead white, which would be a stack lead white, which has even heavier particles than what I have here. At least that's from my understanding. And what it does is it takes much more of the lead white mixed into the skin tones to raise the value. And therefore, you have a much thicker consistency of paint in the skin tones. If you were to use something like a titanium white, you would have to pre-mix something like yellow ochre into your titanium white so that it wouldn't be so cold and so that it wouldn't be so bright. But if you do have access to lead white, flake white, use it with caution. Make sure that you handle the paint tubes with gloves. Common sense stuff like don't eat the paint, don't just common sense stuff, right? Don't get the paint all over your hands and then eat a Philly cheesesteak. That wouldn't be a good idea now. As long as you keep the paint away from your mouth, you're good to go. Even if you get a little bit of paint on your hands, oil or lead absorption through your skin is not that easy to do. However, it can happen, so just take caution. And if you take caution with that, make sure to hold your paintbrush further back. You'll have no problems working with flake white. I thought I would add that in because that seems to be one of the most common questions when it comes to old master style materials. Now back to the painting development. As you're seeing, it's basically starting to emerge from the mask of the face. The mask of the face is just everything but the features, and we're just working our way into the nose now, which is a feature. So we worked from the mask of the face all the way up into the darkest accents on the eyes and the nose. Now you can approach it however you want, but for me, it seems to be more fun to develop a painting this way, in that it feels very alive. It feels like you're sculpting it. It's a lot more fun than trying to finish every section of the painting all at once and then work that way. Though different approaches when it comes to classical painting styles are all valid, as long as you pick an approach that you like. Remember that all techniques meet at some point, and that's usually the middle stages. And so now you're seeing a little bit of a grayish color being added to the white of the eyes, known as the sclera, which is precisely why I mixed the black and white with a little bit of cobalt blue for the light of the eyes. And now you're going to see the image slowly start to emerge as we start to lay in the planes of the face. This is now where the process starts to slow down a little bit. In the beginning, things move very quickly, and it can be a lot of stress to move the paint around. But once you get towards the middle stages, which is what we're approaching now, this is probably the early middle stages, it gets to be much more analytical. Now remember, the photo reference has been omitted from the footage because I want you to view the painting footage so that you see it as a painting developing on its own and not so much a perfect photographic copy of the reference. And if you do want to recreate this painting, remember, just check out Google Arts and Culture, type in Rembrandt, and you will find a lot of high quality images of Rembrandt paintings, including the one that I used for this painting. And you're also seeing how easily the skin tones blend in to the raw umber drawing color, which is another reason why I like to use raw umber to draw with, because it doesn't affect the skin tones very much. If I were to draw with a bright blue color, that might have some adverse effects that would require a different approach to the paint handling. And now one thing about Rembrandt, and Rembrandt in particular, that I notice is the eyes. Rembrandt pays very specific attention to the eyes, the anatomy of the eyes, the structure of the eye socket, and even the curvature of the tear bags underneath of the eyes. They are carefully developed. And not only are they carefully developed, but there's texture to it, lots of texture. Which is why, once again, at no point in the beginning of this painting, or even throughout the entire duration of the painting, do I add any solvent to the paintbrush or any medium. The only time you see me use medium, or should I say solvent, was when I was drawing the initial sketch. But in fact, the solvent will evaporate into the air after a certain amount of time. So we're going to let the painting rest for a little while. And now that we've returned, the painting is dry. It is dry enough for us to continue to work on, and it's very thick and perfect to build onto. As you're seeing, I just went across the painting with the palette knife in an effort to make sure that none of the paint was in between drying. Being in between drying would not be beneficial to the paint film. And so now that we're adding on another layer to this painting, in fact, I spent about 5 different sittings on this painting, a little bit longer than usual. I switch to walnut oil based lead white, which is lead white number 2 from Rublev. Again, check the description box of this video for more information about that. So what I'm doing once again is pre-mixing the skin tones. So if you missed it the first time, we're doing this again a second time with some editing, of course, so that the video is a reasonable length for you to watch and re-watch. So once again, we're mixing Transparent Mummy. Again, Transparent Mummy is pigment PR102. So any oil paint with the pigment PR102 is going to be very similar to Transparent Mummy, although you could visit naturalpigments.com, I believe it's naturalpigments.com, and you can order the same Transparent Mummy that I'm using. Again, it's a really nice color to use, especially when you mix it with lead tin yellow. Perfection, in my opinion. It's just perfect skin tones with very, very minimal effort. In fact, now that you're watching these skin tones develop, you're actually seeing a different color on the right side, which is actually my older skin tones from my previous mixtures all mixed into one. And I take that paint and reuse it to create thicker mixtures. There it is. I'm using it again. Again, that is paint from last time combined with the palette knife and then reused. And if you're wondering how my paint stays wet after so many days, what I do is I take my paint and stick it into the freezer using a container, making sure, of course, that the paint doesn't get all over the place in the freezer. And typically, if you put your paint in the freezer, it actually preserves it fairly well. And now you're seeing pretty much the same stuff. I'm mixing a cooler set of skin tones now. Notice that I used more lead tin yellow and more of the cobalt blue because I did remember from last time my mixtures initially were a little too warm. And now, of course, we're going to mix that dark reddish color that we mixed before, which is the Alizarin crimson and the vine black. And now we're mixing one right in between, which is mainly raw umber, the vine black, and the alizarin crimson. And I'm not saying divine, I'm saying vine, like grape vine. It is vine black that I'm using. And so now we commence once again from the mask of the face, developing the texture of the painting, and basically just continuing to sculpt the painting. And it's tremendous fun to build the skin tones this way. And now I want to mention another thing that again goes to the main point of this video, which is Old Master style painting demonstration. There is something to this particular color palette that I've noticed is very useful for Old Master style textures. And that is, if you look at the list of colors, most of the colors are actually transparent. What that does is that since most of the colors, albeit the warmer colors, are very transparent, the more opaque colors that are very light, such as lead white and lead tin yellow, since those colors are opaque and very heavy, they carry through a very translucent layer of skin tone, but very thick layer of skin tone because of the opacity or the thickness of lead white and lead tin yellow. My cobalt blue is also fairly opaque, but everything else on the palette is transparent. So that actually enables the skin tone to appear very translucent in order to mimic the texture of human skin. So human skin is pretty transparent looking. It's pretty if you look at human skin, of course, if you look at your own hands or your own arms, you'll notice it's not one matte color. It's not a very matte, opaque looking color. It's a whole bunch of other colors mixed in together. And that is precisely the type of effect that we're getting with this color palette. And now we've switched into a Sable brush to paint in the details. And now what you're seeing are alkyd oil paints. So that is titanium white, yellow ochre, raw umber, and ivory black, along with a synthetic brush. So after painting in the details that you saw before and adding a drop of spike lavender to the mix, we're going to start to block in the background. And since this is a fairly highly edited video, it's going to go through very quickly. And the background is a combination of raw umber, yellow ochre, and ivory black, with a drop or two of spike lavender. Now notice that none of the spike lavender has gone into the skin tones, and none of the alkyd oil paint has gone into the skin tones. So the alkyd oil paint is a fast drying oil paint, which again is why I'm using a synthetic brush. And there's no reason for me using a synthetic brush other than the fact that I don't want to ruin my bristle brushes. Because alkyd oil paint dries pretty quickly and is pretty rough on your brushes, to say the least. So that's why I use synthetic brushes. They're cheaper, they're easier to get, they don't really carry a lot of paint, but if they get damaged, it's not as big of a deal as damaging one of my bristle brushes. That's just a no-no. That would just not fly. That would not be something that I would want to do. So that's why I use the cheaper brushes with the alkyds. Now, speaking of the alkyds, we're moving into the texture of the clothing that the model's wearing, the headdress, or whatever you want to call it, that the model's wearing, and the ruff. So since I'm using titanium white, I do add a little bit of yellow ochre into the white as I'm mixing. And I am taking as much as I can from the palette, and I'm very careful not to mix the alkyd into the skin tone. In fact, the area where the alkyd and the skin tone meet is very, very thin. There's almost no overlap of the alkyd into the skin tones. Now you may be wondering why I'm using alkyd in the background and regular oil paints in the skin tone. It is again because of the drying time. I want the background to be dry the next day so that I can work on the skin tones wet on wet. Because I'm using walnut oil, the skin tones actually won't be completely dry the next day, and in fact will take a couple days to be dry enough to rework. Now going back to the topic of old master painting, the clothing that the models wear in the old school paintings are very stylistic for oil painting. So in fact, if you want to create a style to your paintings, if you want to have a style to your paintings that appear 17th century, a lot of it actually has to do with the clothing that they're wearing, along with the way that you paint the portrait, of course. Imagine if I painted her in a hoodie or wearing, like some headphones or whatever. It would jump from 17th century looking to a more modern painting, which actually wouldn't be that bad to do. But in any case, the clothing does have a lot to do with the style. And now with the clothing, look for values, light and shadow, mid-tones, and build it just like the portrait, just like the face. And that's all it is. Now obviously at this point, if you compare the Rembrandt study that you're seeing on your screen here to the original, there are differences in the forehead, there are differences in how much of the side of the face is showing. So as I said before, this is a master study and not a master copy. There are differences now in the painting that are quite obvious. So before you're quick to tell me that I'm completely wrong, I'm letting you know that there are differences in here, and I'm fine with them. I'm not going to chase them. And the alkyd at this point is already starting to become tacky, which means it's already starting to dry. And less than 30 minutes has gone by at this point, painting in the headdress, and it already becomes tacky. Now, if I had bristle brushes here, and the paint starts to get tacky, it would definitely harm the brushes. Another nice thing to note about alkyds is that when they dry, they don't sink in quite as much as regular oil paints. Why that is, I don't really know. I can't tell you why that is. But when you use alkyd for backgrounds, it actually is pretty nice for that reason, in that they don't sink in quite as much. And especially if you want to have a chiaroscuro effect, meaning a very nice dark and matte, almost matte-like background, alkyd is actually the way to go for that effect. Just be very careful with your brushes, and be very careful not to get the alkyd in your skin tones. And one of the biggest secrets to an old master style painting is the time it takes to do it. So give yourself as much time as possible. Forget about the alla prima-ness of a painting. Forget about trying to do something quickly. It's a way to detach from the rapidity and instant gratification world that we live in today, and to really slow down and spend your time studying the nuance and the delicacy of old master paintings. So give yourself as much time as you need. Forget about alla prima. Just spend your time working. Yes, you can start alla prima like I did with this one. Alla prima just means wet on wet, but it also means all at once at the same time. So don't feel like you need to paint it all at once. This painting took several hours, 5 different days to complete. Now some days I only painted maybe 30 or 40 minutes, so it's not 5 full days, but 5 days altogether, with the first day taking about the most time. And now we're using alkyd for the halftone of the side of the ruff. And this part is going to go through rather quickly. And there it is. As I promised, it's going through rather quickly, as this is a highly edited video. As you see there, yellow ochre was mixed directly into the titanium white to give it more of a flake white type appearance. Had I gone straight with titanium white, it would be too blue and it would not appear naturalistic. And the alkyds, by the way, are all Winsor Newton Griffin alkyds. And again, very careful not to get the alkyd into the skin tone. And now the painting really starts to take form. Notice that the background is left completely dark. I purposefully omitted the dark of the clothing for her shoulder just to have more of a ghostly type effect. It's kind of the floating head amongst the dark. That's a change that I created on purpose, just for the effect. And just a few more details into the rough. And after this video clip, a couple days, actually 2 days pass in between, where very little went onto the skin tones, but you'll notice the difference. And it's going to basically surmise the fact that you need to take time with these paintings. Now, it would be very difficult to show that much footage on a single YouTube video, so take note again that the time it takes is one of the most important factors. Make sure to give yourself all the time you need, and don't worry too much about the alla prima-ness of your paintings. Now a few last touches, and there you have it. The Rembrandt Master Study. Again, I really hope that this week's video helps you out, and if you find that it does, please check out my online classes on patreon.com/upariartist. And in my online classes, we have over 50 plus lessons with 2 new lessons added every single week. Again, patreon.com/upariartist. Again, thank you so much for watching this week's YouTube video. I really hope that these videos help you out. Again, I wish you the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.